The holiday season brings out the best and worst in people. Shopping malls become these chaotic places where strangers bump into each other. Kids cry for toys they can't have, and everyone's rushing to find that perfect gift. But sometimes, in the middle of all that chaos, something happens that changes everything. David was standing near the food court, trying to catch his breath. His daughter Lily had been pulling him from store to store for the past 2 hours. She was 6 years old and full of energy, the kind of kid who could turn a simple shopping trip into a marathon. David loved that about her, even when his legs were tired and his patience was wearing thin. He bought them both some coffee and juice, finding a quiet spot where they could rest for a minute. The mall was packed with people, all moving in different directions like a human river. Christmas music played overhead, competing with the sound of conversations and footsteps echoing off the tile floors. That's when he noticed the piano. Right there in the center of the food court, someone had set up a beautiful black grand piano. It was part of the mall's holiday display, surrounded by twinkling lights and fake snow. Throughout the day, people would stop and play a few notes, some good, some terrible, but all of them trying to add a little music to the shopping experience. David stared at that piano longer than he meant to. Something about it made his chest feel tight. He hadn't been near a piano in 3 years. Hadn't wanted to be. There were too many memories attached to those keys. Too many feelings he'd locked away in a box marked "Do Not Open." "Daddy, look at that man," Lily said, pointing toward the piano. A guy in an expensive-looking suit was standing next to the piano, talking loudly to anyone who would listen. He had that kind of presence that demanded attention, the type of person who walks into a room and expects everyone to notice. His watch probably cost more than David's car, and his smile was the kind you see in toothpaste commercials, perfect but somehow not quite real. The man was encouraging people to play. He'd point at random strangers and try to convince them to sit down and perform. Some people laughed and walked away. Others gave it a try, playing chopsticks or jingle bells while the crowd clapped politely. He was turning it into a show, and he clearly loved being the host. David tried to make himself invisible. He knew guys like this. They meant well usually, but they didn't understand boundaries. They thought everyone wanted to be in the spotlight, that a little pushing was just friendly encouragement. They didn't get that some people had reasons for staying in the shadows, but invisible wasn't something David could pull off today. Maybe it was the way he was standing, that military posture he couldn't quite shake even after leaving the service. Maybe it was the look in his eyes, that distant stare that veterans sometimes have when they're lost in thought. Whatever it was, the man in the suit noticed him. "Hey, you there?"
"Yes, you with the little girl?"
David's stomach dropped. He shook his head slightly, trying to signal that he wasn't interested. Lily looked up at him with curious eyes, sensing her father's discomfort but not understanding why. The man walked over, his smile growing wider. "Come on, don't be shy. It's the holidays. Time to spread some joy, right? You look like you've got an interesting story. I bet you can play something nice for us." "No, thank you," David said quietly, his voice firm but polite. "We're just passing through." "Nonsense. Everyone can play a little something. Even if it's just Mary Had a Little Lamb. The kids love it. Your daughter would probably think it's cool to see her dad up there, right, sweetie?" Lily looked between her father and the stranger, unsure what to say. David felt his jaw tighten. This was exactly what he'd been trying to avoid. The attention, the pressure, the expectation that he should perform on command like some kind of circus animal. "I really can't," David said, his tone a bit harder now. He took Lily's hand, preparing to walk away, but the man wasn't giving up. He'd gathered a small crowd now, and they were all looking at David with encouraging faces. Some were smiling, others nodding, a few holding up their phones like they were ready to record whatever happened next. The man in the suit was feeding off the energy, clearly enjoying his role as the master of ceremonies. "Come on, everyone. Let's give him some encouragement. Show him we're a friendly crowd." A few people started clapping. Someone called out, "Go for it." Another person said, "Yeah, play something." The pressure was building and David felt trapped. He could feel his heart rate increasing, that familiar anxiety crawling up his spine. This was the kind of situation that triggered all his old responses, the ones he'd been working so hard to manage in therapy. Lily squeezed his hand. "It's okay, Daddy, we can just go." That almost broke him. His little girl, sensing his distress and trying to protect him. She was 6 years old and already learning to read his moods, to navigate around his invisible wounds. That wasn't fair to her. She deserved a father who could handle a simple thing like this without falling apart. David took a deep breath. He'd been trained to face uncomfortable situations head-on. In the military, they'd taught him that sometimes you have to push through fear, through pain, through everything your mind is telling you to avoid. This was just a piano, just an instrument. It couldn't hurt him, not really. "Okay," he said, more to himself than to anyone else. "Okay, I'll do it." The man in the suit clapped his hands together like he'd just won something. "Wonderful. That's the spirit. Come on over here, let's get you set up." David walked toward the piano slowly, Lily's hand still in his. Each step felt heavier than the last. The crowd parted to let them through, and suddenly they were standing right next to the instrument. Up close, it was even more beautiful. The wood was polished to a mirror shine, and the keys looked pristine, like they were waiting for someone who knew what to do with them. Sit down," the man encouraged, gesturing to the bench. "Don't be nervous. Everyone here is friendly. We're all just looking for a little entertainment with our shopping, you know?" David sat down slowly. Lily climbed up next to him, her small body pressed against his side. He could feel her warmth, her trust that everything was going to be okay because Daddy was here, and Daddy always knew what to do. If only that were true. His hands hovered over the keys. They were shaking slightly, just enough that he hoped nobody else could see it. The last time he'd touched a piano, his wife had been sitting right next to him, her laughter filling their living room as she tried to teach him her favorite piece. That was before everything changed. Before the deployment, before the attack, before his whole world collapsed in a single afternoon, halfway across the world. The crowd had grown larger now. At least 50 people were watching, phones raised, waiting to see what this reluctant man would do. The man in the suit stood off to the side, arms crossed with satisfaction, clearly pleased with himself for making this happen. David closed his eyes. "Just play something," he told himself. "Get it over with, and then you can go home and forget this ever happened." His fingers found their position on the keys, muscle memory taking over even though his mind was screaming at him to run. And then, despite everything, despite all the reasons he shouldn't, David began to play. The first note rang out across the food court, clear and pure. Then came the second and the third. Within seconds, the entire atmosphere changed. People who'd been walking past stopped mid-step. Conversations died in the middle of sentences. Even the workers behind the food counters paused what they were doing to listen. David wasn't just playing the piano. He was making it sing. His fingers moved across the keys with a grace that seemed impossible for hands that big, hands that had held weapons and carried wounded soldiers. But these same hands had once been trained for something entirely different, something beautiful. The music that poured out wasn't some simple children's tune or a popular song everyone knew. This was classical music, the kind you'd hear in concert halls, played by professionals who'd spent their entire lives mastering their craft. The man in the expensive suit stood frozen, his mouth slightly open. The satisfied smirk he'd been wearing just moments ago had vanished completely. He looked like someone who'd just opened what they thought was a regular door and found themselves staring at the edge of the Grand Canyon. Lily watched her father with wide eyes. She'd seen him do a lot of things. She'd seen him make breakfast with military precision, fold laundry in perfect squares, and fix things around their small apartment with patience and skill. But she'd never seen him like this. His whole body had changed. The tension that usually lived in his shoulders had melted away. His face, normally so controlled and careful, had softened into something almost peaceful. The piece he was playing was heartbreakingly beautiful. It started soft and gentle like a whisper or a memory. Then it built slowly, gaining strength and emotion with each passing measure. Some people in the crowd recognized it as Chopin, one of the great composers. Others didn't know what it was, but they knew it was special. David's eyes were closed now. Tears started running down his face, but his hands never stopped moving. The music kept flowing like a river that had been dammed up for too long, and finally found its way through. Every note carried weight, carried meaning, carried pain that words could never express. A woman in the crowd started crying. Then another person and another. Something about the music was reaching into people's chests and touching places they usually kept locked away. It wasn't just beautiful. It was honest in a way that made you feel less alone with your own hidden sorrows. The food court had gone completely silent except for the piano. Maybe 100 people were gathered now and more were coming. Some stood with their hands over their hearts. Others held onto their partners or friends, needing something solid to keep them grounded. Parents pulled their children close, and teenagers who usually couldn't go 5 minutes without checking their phones just stood there, completely absorbed. David transitioned into another piece without stopping. This one was different, more personal somehow. Later, some people would realize it wasn't something famous at all. It was his own composition, something he'd written years ago in what felt like another lifetime. The melody was filled with longing and loss, but also with moments of hope that flickered like candles in the darkness. His hands were shaking now, but they never missed a note. The muscle memory was too deep, too much a part of who he'd been before everything changed. The piano had once been his refuge, his way of making sense of the world. Then it had become too painful to touch, too connected to memories he couldn't bear to face. As the music swelled toward its climax, David's whole body seemed to pour into the performance. His shoulders rose and fell, his head moved slightly with the rhythm, and the tears kept coming. He wasn't playing for the crowd anymore. He wasn't even really in the mall. He was somewhere else, some place in his mind where the music could take him, where for just a few minutes he could be close to what he'd lost. The man who'd pushed him to play was backing away slowly. The color had drained from his face, and his hands were trembling. Something about what he was witnessing had shaken him deeply. This wasn't entertainment. This was a man's soul being laid bare in front of strangers, and it was both beautiful and terrible to watch. Lily reached up and touched her father's arm gently. She didn't understand everything that was happening, but she understood that this was important, that her daddy was doing something that hurt him and healed him at the same time. Her small hand on his arm was like an anchor, reminding him that he wasn't lost in the past, that he had someone here in the present who needed him. The final notes of the piece hung in the air like the last light of sunset. When David's hands finally lifted from the keys, the silence that followed was profound. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. It was as if the entire food court was holding its breath, afraid that making any sound would shatter something precious and fragile. Then, slowly, the applause began. It started with one person, then spread like ripples on water until the entire crowd was clapping. But it wasn't the usual applause you hear after a performance. There was something reverent about it, almost gentle. People were clapping with tears in their eyes, with expressions of wonder and sadness mixed together. David opened his eyes slowly. For a moment he looked confused, like he'd forgotten where he was. Then reality came rushing back. The mall, the crowd, the phones all pointed at him, recording everything. He wiped his face quickly with his sleeve, trying to pull himself back together, trying to rebuild the walls that the music had torn down. That's when it happened. As he raised his arm to wipe away the tears, his jacket sleeve pulled back. Running up his forearm was an intricate tattoo that had been hidden until now. The people closest to the piano saw it first. Their expressions changed from admiration to shock. One woman gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. The tattoo wasn't just decorative artwork. It was a memorial. Names were woven together with musical notes and symbols, creating a design that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. In the center was a portrait of a woman with gentle eyes and a warm smile. Around her were more names, 7 others, each one accompanied by a date. The same date for all of them, a date from 3 years ago. The whispers started immediately. People leaned toward each other, pointing discreetly at David's arm. Someone in the crowd pulled out their phone, not to record anymore, but to search for something. The date on the tattoo had triggered a memory, something they'd seen on the news years ago but had half forgotten in the rush of daily life. "Oh my God," someone said quietly. Then louder, "Oh my God, I know who he is." The man in the suit stepped forward, his face now completely pale. His eyes were locked on the tattoo, on the date, on the portrait of the woman surrounded by musical notes. Recognition hit him like a physical blow. He stumbled slightly, reaching out to steady himself against the piano. You're that soldier," he stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "The one from the embassy attack. The one whose wife—" He couldn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The information was already spreading through the crowd like wildfire. People were showing each other their phones, pulling up old news articles, photos, video footage from 3 years ago that had dominated headlines for weeks before being buried under newer tragedies. David pulled his sleeve back down quickly, but it was too late. The secret he'd been carrying, the reason he'd avoided pianos and crowds and anything that might make him remember, was out. Lily looked up at him with confused eyes. She could feel the shift in the air, the way everyone was looking at her father differently now. Not with admiration for his music, but with something heavier. Pity maybe, or horror, or both. A woman pushed through the crowd, tears streaming down her face. "I remember," she said, her voice cracking with emotion. "Your wife was playing piano when it happened. At the embassy. She kept playing even when the attack started, trying to keep everyone calm." David nodded slowly. He couldn't speak. His throat had closed up completely, and his chest felt like someone had wrapped iron bands around it and was squeezing tighter and tighter. This was exactly what he'd been trying to avoid. This moment, this exposure, this having to relive the worst day of his life in front of strangers. The man in the suit looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. The realization of what he'd done was written all over his face. He'd forced a grieving veteran, a man who'd lost his wife in the most horrific circumstances, to play the same instrument she'd been playing when she died, all for entertainment. All because he thought it would be fun to push someone into the spotlight. The food court had transformed into something entirely different now. What had been a place of casual entertainment just minutes ago now felt heavy with emotion. People weren't just watching anymore. They were part of something they hadn't asked for, witnesses to a man's private grief spilled out in public. The man in the expensive suit took a shaky step forward. His hands were trembling, and all the confidence he'd worn like armor just minutes ago had crumbled away. He looked smaller somehow, like someone had let all the air out of him. "I didn't know," he said, his voice breaking. "I swear I had no idea. I never would have. I'm so sorry. I'm so incredibly sorry." David sat frozen on the piano bench, his daughter pressed against his side. He could feel every pair of eyes on him, every phone camera pointed in his direction. This was his nightmare, the thing he'd been avoiding for 3 years. Being recognized, being pitied, having strangers dig into the worst moment of his life like it was public property, just because it had been on the news. An older man pushed his way through the crowd. He wore a baseball cap with military insignia, the kind veterans wear to identify each other in civilian spaces. His eyes were wet, but his voice was steady when he spoke. "Son, thank you for your service," he said, placing a weathered hand on David's shoulder. "And thank you for that music. What you just shared with us, that took more courage than most people will ever understand." David nodded but couldn't find words. His throat felt like someone had filled it with sand. Lily tugged on his sleeve, her small face scrunched up with worry and confusion. "Daddy, why is everyone looking at us like that?" she whispered. "Did you do something wrong?" That question hit him harder than anything else. His daughter, asking if he'd done something wrong because strangers were staring at them. She was 6 years old. She barely remembered her mother. Most of what she knew came from stories David told her, and photos they looked at together before bedtime. She'd been too young to understand the news coverage, too young to grasp the magnitude of what had happened. "No, sweetheart," David managed to say, his voice rough. "I didn't do anything wrong. These people they just learned something about Daddy that makes them sad." More people were gathering now, and with them came more recognition. A teenage girl showed her mother something on her phone. An elderly woman covered her mouth with both hands, tears spilling down her cheeks. 2 men in business suits stood side by side, both looking like they'd been punched in the stomach. The story was simple enough, the kind that made headlines and then faded into the background noise of tragedy that fills our news feeds. 3 years ago, there had been an attack on an embassy overseas. David had been there as part of the security detail. His wife, a professional pianist, had been giving a charity concert to raise money for music education programs in the region. She believed music could bridge cultures, could heal divisions, could make the world just a little bit better. When the attack started, chaos erupted. Explosions, gunfire, people screaming and running in every direction. David had been outside the main hall doing a perimeter check. By the time he fought his way back inside, it was too late. 8 people had died that day, including his wife. The news footage that went viral showed her still at the piano in those final moments, playing to calm the panicked crowd even as violence erupted around her. A woman stepped forward from the crowd, younger than most, maybe in her late 20s. She had her phone clutched in her hand, tears streaming down her face. "I was there," she said quietly. Everyone turned to look at her. "At the embassy." I was an intern working in the education office. Your wife's concert was the reason I was even in that building that day. David's head snapped up. He stared at the woman, really seeing her for the first time. I remember her playing. The woman continued, her voice shaking. When everything started happening, when people were screaming and trying to get out, she just kept playing. I was frozen, terrified, didn't know what to do. But hearing that music, it helped me think straight. It helped me find an exit. Your wife saved my life. The silence that followed was absolute. David opened his mouth, but no sound came out. In 3 years, he'd never met anyone who'd been there that day besides other security personnel. He'd never talked to anyone who'd heard his wife's final performance, who'd been helped by her decision to keep playing when any rational person would have run. The man in the suit was crying now, openly, not bothering to hide it. I forced you to relive that, he said, his voice thick with shame. I pushed you to play the same instrument she was playing when she... God, what kind of person does that? David looked at him for a long moment. The anger he probably should have felt wasn't there. Maybe he was too tired for anger. Maybe he'd spent so much energy just surviving day to day that he didn't have any left for rage at some stranger who'd made a thoughtless mistake. You didn't know, David said finally. Nobody ever does. That's the thing about grief, about trauma. We all walk around carrying things nobody can see. You can't tell by looking at someone what they've survived. The man shook his head violently. That's not good enough. I should have been more thoughtful. I should have respected your first no. I treated you like entertainment, like you existed for my amusement. That's wrong regardless of what you've been through. He was right, and they both knew it, but David was too exhausted to make him feel worse than he already did. What's your name? David asked. Richard, the man said. Richard Morrison. Well, Richard, you want to make this right?
Really make it right, not just throw money at it to make yourself feel better?
Richard nodded eagerly, desperately. Yes, anything, whatever you need. Then learn something from this, David said. Learn that everyone you meet is carrying something. Every single person in this mall right now. They all have their own battles, their own losses, their own pain. Maybe some of them lost someone too. Maybe some of them are barely holding it together. You can't see it just by looking at them, but it's there. He gestured to the crowd that had gathered. Learn to ask instead of demand. Learn that no means no, even if you think you're just being friendly. Learn that people have reasons for their boundaries, and those reasons deserve respect even if you don't know what they are. Richard was nodding, tears still running down his face. You're right. You're absolutely right. I've been so focused on making every moment entertaining, on being the guy who makes things happen, that I forgot people aren't props in my story. They're living their own stories, and I have no right to force them into mine. A reporter had arrived, must have been nearby when word spread about what was happening. She approached carefully, her camera operator hanging back at a respectful distance. Excuse me, she said gently. I'm with the local news. Would you be willing to talk about what happened here today? David looked down at Lily, who was still pressed against his side, trying to make sense of everything happening around them. For 3 years, he'd avoided reporters. He'd turned down every interview request, refused to speak publicly about his wife or the attack or anything else. He'd wanted privacy, wanted to raise his daughter away from the spotlight, away from being defined by the worst day of their lives. But something felt different now. Maybe it was the woman who'd told him about being saved by his wife's music. Maybe it was seeing Richard's genuine remorse and desire to change. Maybe it was just being tired of running from his own story. Not here, David said. Not now, but maybe sometime. If I do talk, though, it's not going to be about me. It's going to be about her, about what she believed in, what she was trying to do. She died bringing music to people who needed it, and that deserves to be remembered. The reporter nodded, understanding. She handed him a card. Whenever you're ready. No pressure. And for what it's worth, I remember your wife. She came to my daughter's school once, donated instruments to their music program. She was remarkable. More people were coming forward now, each with their own connection to the story. Someone whose child had learned piano through a program his wife founded. Someone who'd been inspired by the news coverage to start their own charity. Someone who'd served in the military and understood what it meant to lose people you cared about in violent places far from home. David listened to them all, each story adding another layer to his understanding of how his wife's life and death had rippled outward in ways he'd never known. Lily listened too, starting to piece together a picture of the mother she'd lost, the woman she'd been too young to really remember, but would spend her whole life trying to know. The video went viral overnight. Someone in the crowd had recorded David's performance and uploaded it within minutes. By the next morning, it had millions of views. But it wasn't just the music that captured people's attention. It was the whole story, the context, the raw humanity of what had unfolded in that food court. David woke up to his phone buzzing nonstop. Text messages, emails, friend requests from strangers, news outlets wanting interviews. His small apartment felt even smaller with all this attention pressing in from the outside world. Lily sat at the kitchen table eating cereal, oblivious to the storm gathering around them. "Daddy, are you famous now?" she asked between bites. "I don't think so, sweetheart," David said, though he wasn't sure that was true anymore. People are just interested in what happened yesterday. But it was more than interest. The comment sections under the video were filled with thousands of people sharing their own stories. Veterans talking about their struggles with loss and trauma. People who'd lost loved ones in attacks or accidents or illnesses. Single parents raising kids alone and barely holding it together. The video had cracked something open in people, given them permission to talk about the pain they usually kept hidden. Richard Morrison's apology video posted that same morning. He sat in what looked like his home office, no fancy suit, no practiced smile, just a man who looked like he hadn't slept talking directly to the camera. "I made a terrible mistake yesterday," he said. "I treated another human being like he existed for my entertainment. I pushed when I should have stepped back. I ignored someone's clear discomfort because I thought I knew better, because I wanted to create a moment without considering what that moment might cost the person I was forcing into it." He paused, wiping his eyes. "I've spent my whole life being the guy who makes things happen, who gets people excited, who creates experiences. But I forgot that people aren't puppets. They're not here to perform for me. Everyone is fighting battles we can't see, carrying losses we can't imagine. I should have respected that. I should have been better." The video resonated with millions. People appreciated his honesty, his willingness to admit fault without making excuses. Some criticized him, said his apology wasn't enough. Others shared their own stories of times they'd pushed too hard, demanded too much, failed to see the person behind the role they wanted them to play. David watched the video alone in his bedroom after Lily went to school. He felt strange about it. Part of him was still angry at Richard for what happened. Part of him understood that Richard had genuinely learned something, that his remorse was real. Mostly he just felt tired. The messages kept coming. A veterans organization wanted him to speak at their next event. A music school asked if he'd consider teaching. A grief counselor offered free sessions. A documentary filmmaker wanted to tell his wife's story. The local news was still asking for an interview. Then one message stood out from all the others. It came from the embassy where his wife had died. They were planning a memorial concert for the upcoming anniversary of the attack, the 4th anniversary. They wanted David to perform. They'd also established a foundation in his wife's name to continue her work, bringing music education to children who wouldn't otherwise have access to it. David stared at the email for a long time. The thought of going back there to that place where everything ended made his chest tight. But something else tugged at him too. Curiosity, maybe, or the need to see it with his own eyes, to understand what his wife had been trying to build in those final months of her life. Over the next few weeks, more people reached out. The woman from the food court who'd survived the attack invited him for coffee. Her name was Jessica, and she'd been struggling with survivor's guilt for 3 years, wondering why she'd lived when others hadn't. "I've never told anyone this," Jessica said as they sat in a quiet cafe. "But I hear your wife's music sometimes when I'm falling asleep. Not the actual sound, but the memory of it. It's the only thing that helps when the nightmares get bad." They talked for 2 hours. Jessica told him about the education programs his wife had been developing, about the instruments she'd donated to local schools, about her vision for using music to bring communities together. David had known his wife loved her work, but he hadn't fully understood the scope of what she'd been building. "She talked about you all the time," Jessica said, "about how you'd been the one who got her interested in classical music in the first place. She said you had this way of hearing things in a piece that most people missed, these little details that made the music come alive." David felt his eyes burning. "I haven't played since she died. Yesterday was the first time I'd touched a piano in 3 years." "I know," Jessica said gently. "I could tell. But David, what you played yesterday, it was like hearing her again. Not the same, but connected somehow. like you were continuing the conversation you two used to have through music. That conversation stayed with David for days. He started thinking about the memorial concert, about what it would mean to go back. Lily noticed the change in him. Her father had always been present but distant, there but not quite there. Now he seemed to be waking up from a long sleep. Richard reached out directly, not through social media but with a handwritten letter delivered to David's apartment. In it, he explained that he'd been volunteering at a local veterans center, listening to their stories, learning about the challenges they faced. He'd made a substantial donation to the music foundation created in David's wife's name. But more importantly, he'd become an advocate. "I've been using my platform," the letter read, "to talk about mental health, about respecting boundaries, about seeing people as whole human beings rather than potential entertainment. It's not enough to make up for what I did to you, but it's a start. You taught me something crucial in those few minutes we talked, something I should have learned decades ago." The letter included an invitation. Richard was organizing a fundraiser for the Music Foundation and other veteran support organizations. He wanted David to be part of it, but only if he was comfortable. No pressure, the letter emphasized. "I mean that this time. Your no will be respected and honored, whatever you decide." David showed the letter to Lily that evening. She'd been asking more questions about her mother lately, processing what she'd learned at the mall. The other kids at school had seen the video too, and suddenly everyone wanted to know about the girl whose mom was a hero. "Are you going to go, Daddy?" Lily asked. "I don't know yet," David admitted. "It's complicated. Mom would want you to play again," Lily said with the simple certainty only children have. "I think she'd be sad if you never played because of what happened to her." Out of the mouths of babes, David thought. His 6-year-old daughter had cut through all his complicated feelings and touched something true. His wife had loved music more than almost anything. She'd believed in its power to heal, to connect, to transform. Letting that piano in the food court gather dust inside him wasn't honoring her memory. It was letting the people who'd killed her take even more than they already had. The decision didn't come all at once. It built slowly over days and weeks. David started playing again, quietly, on a keyboard he bought and set up in the corner of their living room. Just a few minutes at a time at first, then longer. Lily would sit and listen, sometimes doing her homework, sometimes just watching her father's hands move across the keys. He reached out to the embassy, accepting their invitation to perform at the memorial concert. He contacted Richard, agreeing to participate in the fundraiser. He called the reporter who'd given him her card and agreed to an interview, but with conditions. It had to focus on his wife's work, on the foundation being built in her name, on the children who would benefit from the program she'd started. Jessica became a regular part of their lives, sometimes joining them for dinner, sharing stories about the projects she and David's wife had worked on together. Through her, David began to understand his wife's final months in a way he never had before. She'd been building something bigger than either of them, something that would outlast her. The hardest conversation was with Lily. She deserved to know the full story, age-appropriate but honest. David told her about the attack, about how her mother had kept playing to help people stay calm, about how she'd been brave even when she was scared. Was she a hero? Lily asked. David thought about that. She was just trying to help people. I think that's what heroes do. They see someone who needs help and they do what they can even when it's hard or scary. Like you, Lily said. You played even though it made you sad. David pulled his daughter close. Maybe we're both learning to be brave like Mom was. The responses to the news interview when it aired were overwhelming. Thousands of people donated to the Music Foundation. Schools reached out asking about instrument donation programs. Other musicians offered to perform benefit concerts. What had started as a moment of forced performance in a mall food court had grown into something his wife would have been proud of. But the most meaningful response came from someone unexpected. A teenager from overseas sent a video of herself playing violin. Your wife's foundation gave me this instrument 2 years ago, she said in careful English. I had never touched a violin before. Now I practice every day. Next year I start at a music conservatory. Thank you for sharing your wife with us. She changed my life. David watched the video 3 times, tears streaming down his face. This was his wife's legacy. Not the tragedy of how she died, but the beauty of how she'd lived and what she'd built. The flight felt longer than it actually was. David sat with Lily by the window, watching clouds drift past as they crossed the ocean. His daughter had never been on a plane before, and her excitement helped distract him from the knot of anxiety in his stomach. They were flying back to the place where his life had shattered 4 years ago. Jessica met them at the airport. She'd gone back 6 months after the attack to continue the work she and David's wife had started, refusing to let fear win. Seeing her there, holding a sign with Lily's name decorated with musical notes, David felt a surge of gratitude. He wasn't doing this alone. "Welcome back," Jessica said, and the way she said it acknowledged both the difficulty and the importance of what he was doing. The embassy had been rebuilt. The damaged sections had been restored and new security measures were everywhere. But the concert hall where his wife had performed her final show had been preserved and renovated as a memorial space. That's where the anniversary concert would take place. David asked to see it the day before the performance. He needed to face it without an audience, without cameras, without the pressure of performance. The embassy staff understood and gave him a private hour. Walking into that hall was like stepping into a memory that had been frozen in time. The stage looked almost the same. The acoustics still had that perfect quality his wife had loved. But now there were plaques on the wall with the names of the 8 people who'd died. His wife's name was first, followed by 7 others who'd been there that day trying to make the world a little better. Lily held his hand tightly. She was old enough now to understand where they were and what it meant. They stood together in silence, looking at her mother's name engraved in polished bronze. "She was really brave, wasn't she?" Lily whispered. "The bravest person I ever knew," David said. He walked up to the stage slowly, each step feeling heavier than the last. The piano waiting there was new, a gift from a music company that had heard the story, but it was positioned in the exact spot where his wife's piano had been. David sat down on the bench and let his hands rest on the keys without playing. "I'm here," he said quietly, not sure if he was talking to his wife's memory or to himself or to the universe. "I'm finally here." He played a few soft notes, then a few more. The music that came out was tentative at first, like someone testing the ice on a frozen lake. But as his confidence grew, so did the music. He played the piece his wife had been performing when the attack happened, the one she'd written herself. He'd never been able to listen to it after she died, let alone play it. But now, in this space, it felt like the only right thing to do. Lily climbed up on the bench beside him, just like she'd done at the mall. She didn't say anything, just pressed close to her father's side, offering her silent support. When the piece ended, David felt something shift inside him. Not healing exactly, because some wounds never fully heal, but acceptance maybe. The understanding that he could carry his grief and still move forward, that honoring his wife's memory didn't mean staying frozen in the moment she died. The next evening, the concert hall filled with people. Survivors from the attack sat in the front rows alongside family members of those who'd died. Diplomats and embassy staff were there. Local musicians who'd been part of his wife's programs came. Children who'd received instruments through her foundation performed first, their music a testament to the seeds she'd planted that continued to grow. Richard Morrison was there too, sitting quietly in the back. He'd flown halfway around the world not to be recognized or praised, but to witness what his thoughtless action had set in motion. He'd told David in an email, "I need to see what your wife built. I need to understand what was at stake that day in the mall, what I was asking you to expose without even knowing it." When it was David's turn to perform, he walked onto the stage with Lily beside him. That hadn't been planned, but his daughter had asked if she could be there with him. And he'd realized he wanted that too. She sat on the bench next to him, just like she had at the mall, just like she had yesterday during his private visit. "Good evening," David said to the crowd, his voice steady despite his racing heart. "4 years ago, my wife stood on this stage and played music to bring people together. When violence tried to tear that apart, she kept playing, not because she was fearless, but because she believed in the power of music to heal, to connect, to remind us of our shared humanity." He paused, looking down at Lily. "I stopped playing when she died. I couldn't touch a piano without feeling like I was breaking into pieces. But a few months ago, someone pushed me to play when I didn't want to. It was uncomfortable and painful, and I resented it at the time, but it opened a door I'd kept locked for too long." The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. "My wife didn't die playing piano. She died trying to help people, and the piano just happened to be her tool." Tonight, I'm not here to relive tragedy. I'm here to celebrate what she built and to help it continue growing. Because the best way to honor someone's memory isn't to freeze them in the moment they died. It's to keep their work alive. David began to play. He chose the same piece he'd played at the mall, the one that had started everything. But this time felt different. There were still tears, but they didn't feel like they were drowning him. There was still pain, but it existed alongside something else now. Hope, maybe, or purpose. Lily watched her father play, and as she listened, she understood her mother in a way she never had before. Not through photos or stories, but through the music that connected them across time and loss. She saw how her mother's passion lived on in her father's hands, in the children playing instruments in the audience, in the programs that continued to spread music around the world. When the performance ended, the applause was thunderous, but David barely heard it. He was looking at the plaque on the wall with his wife's name, and for the first time in 4 years he felt like he could look at it without drowning in grief. The loss would always be there, sharp and real, but it didn't define everything anymore. After the concert, people lined up to thank him, to share their own stories of loss and healing, to tell him about the ways his wife's work had touched their lives. A young woman from the local area approached with her daughter, who clutched a violin case. "Your wife's foundation gave my daughter this violin 3 years ago," the woman said in accented English. "She practices every day. Next year she auditions for the National Youth Orchestra. You and your wife changed our family's life." The little girl played a short piece right there in the concert hall, her performance rough around the edges but filled with heart. Lily watched with wide eyes, seeing a future version of herself perhaps, or just understanding that her mother's dream was bigger than any one person. Richard approached hesitantly after most people had left. "Thank you for letting me be here," he said. "I needed to see this, to understand what your wife was building, what you're continuing." David nodded. "You made a mistake that day at the mall. But mistakes can become doorways if we're willing to walk through them. You did the work. You learned. You changed. That matters." "I've been thinking," Richard said carefully, "about starting a foundation of my own. Not music, but mental health support for people dealing with loss and trauma. Maybe particularly focused on helping people who feel pressured to hide their pain, to perform normalcy when they're falling apart inside. Would you be willing to advise?" David considered this. "On one condition. You never force anyone to share their story before they're ready. You create spaces where people can open up if they choose, but you respect their no. Always." "Always," Richard agreed. Jessica found David as the evening was winding down. "Your wife would be so proud," she said. "Not just of the performance, but of everything. The way you've honored her work, the way you're raising Lily, the way you've transformed pain into purpose." "I'm not sure I've transformed anything," David said. "Most days I'm still just trying to get through." "That's what transformation looks like," Jessica said. "Not some dramatic change, but small choices made every day. To keep going, to stay open, to let the music back in." On the flight home, Lily fell asleep against David's shoulder. He looked down at her peaceful face and thought about the journey they'd been on together. From the chaos of that mall food court to the memorial concert, from frozen grief to something that felt almost like healing. His phone buzzed with a message. It was from the foundation established in his wife's name. A school in a remote area had just received their first shipment of instruments. Kids who'd never had access to music education were about to discover what his wife had always known: that music doesn't just entertain, it transforms. David looked out the window at the clouds below, golden in the sunset. He thought about the tattoo on his arm with his wife's portrait and the words, "Through music you live forever." When he'd gotten that tattoo, he'd meant it as a memorial, a way to carry her with him. Now he understood it differently. She lived forever, not in ink on his skin, but in every child who learned to play, in every concert that brought people together, in every moment someone chose connection over division. The piano at the mall had been a trap he'd walked into reluctantly. But it had also been a doorway, one he'd needed to walk through even if he hadn't known it at the time. Sometimes we need to be pushed toward the things that scare us most, not because it's easy, but because on the other side of that fear is the life we're meant to be living. David closed his eyes and let himself drift. For the first time in 4 years, he fell asleep without nightmares, and in his dreams he heard music.